absolute value of numbers. We're going to explore distances from 0 a little more closely. So our I cans are I can explain what the absolute value of a number is. I can find the absolute values of rational numbers, and I can recognize and use notation for absolute value. So make sure you got all that down. Today's date, your I cans, page number, all that. And now we'll dive into a number talk closer to 0. So taking a look at these, which of those pairs is closest to 0? Yeah, in this first one, it's 9/11ths, right? Both of them are 11ths. You've got 15 11ths here, which means it is more than 11 11ths, 1 whole. And this is less than 1 whole, so it's closer to 0. What about 1/5 or 1/9? Well, since the numerators are the same, we're talking about the denominators. We know that 9 as a denominator is going to make smaller pieces than fifths would. What about this one? 1 and 25/100ths and 5/4ths. These are actually equal, aren't they? So neither one of them is closer. Think about it. We can figure that out pretty quick because 5/4ths is 1 whole, 4/4ths. And that leaves 1/4 left. Well, 1/4 as a fraction is 25/100ths. If I multiplied both those by 25, I'd get 25/100ths. So those are equal. What about this one? Yeah, this one, it's easier to see that this is closer to 0. Here, the 1,000ths, because this is in the hundredths place. So thousandths is closer to 0 than hundredths. All right, so we're going to take a look at some jumping fleas. Oh, cat dog. All right, let's take a look. So a flea is jumping around on this number line. If the flea starts at the 1 and jumps 4 units to the right, where does that end up? Well, so 4 units to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's going to end up here, right? And that's at 5 units away. So it ends up with 5 units away from 0. Okay, what about this one? Starts at 1 again, but now jumps 4 units to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4. Where is it now? Yeah, it's at -3, isn't it? Because look, we are 3 units away from 0. And how far away is that from 0? It's 3 units. Even though this is on the negative side, it's still only 3 units because we've only gone 3 units away. If the flea lands at 0 and jumps 3 units away, where might it end up? Well, there's 2 possible places, right? So if it's at 0 and it jumps 3 units, it could end up here, or it could jump 3 units this way. So it could end up at 3 or -3 for that matter. It just depends. But either one of them is going to work fine, right? Because it says jumps 3 units away. It's going to end up doing that. What about here? If the flea jumps 7 units and lands at 0, where could it have started? Well, it doesn't say which way it jumps, right? So if it lands at 0, it could be all the way over here, right? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here at 7. And it could have jumped 7 units to the left. Or it could have started at -7 and jumped 7 units to the right. So it's either would have been at one of those 2 opposites. All right, the absolute value of a number is the distance it is from 0. The flea is currently left of 0, and the absolute location, absolute value of its location is 4. So where is it on the number line? Remember, we just said that absolute value is however many units, positive, negative, doesn't matter, how many units it is from 0. But it says that it jumped from to the left of 0. And the absolute value, absolute value is 4. So where is it? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4 units. It's at -4, right? I know this because it said it was jumping to the left, and it said it went 4 units. And that ends up putting us at -4. What about if the flea is at is to the left of 0, and the absolute value of its location is 5? Where is it on the number line? If it's to the left of 0 and its absolute value is 5, doesn't it have to be here at -5? Yeah, because it says, we know the absolute value means that that's just however many it is from 0. And again, since it says left, we have to be going into the negative numbers. What about here if the flea is to the right of 0 and has an absolute value of 2 5/10? Where is it on the number line? Yep, again, the absolute value just tells you how far it is from 0. And if we're 2 5/10, it's going to be right here because it said it was to the right of the decimal, or of the 0, excuse me. Okay. So when we use notation like this, when we have the 2 lines like that with a number, we would say the absolute value of -2 means that the absolute, or the distance from -2 from a 0. So what does the absolute value of 7 mean, and what is its value? So the absolute value of -7 is that it is 7 to the left of 0. That's how we know that it's it's worth 7. That's its absolute value is 7, but that means that we're talking about that it's 7 units away from 0. What about here? What does 1 8/10 mean, and what is its value? Well, the absolute value of 1 8/10 is 1 8/10, and that means that it is to the right of 0. Again, we're not talking about, when we're talking about absolute value, we're not talking about whether it's positive or negative. We're talking about where it is in relation to that 0. Let's get a bit of definition down here for absolute value. So absolute value of a number is its distance from 0 on the number line. So you might want to jot this example down. The absolute value here of -7 is 7 because it's 7 units away from 0. Absolute value of 5 is 5 because it's 5 units away from 0. Basically, again, all we're saying here is not whether the number is positive or negative, but its value in relation to that 0. Where does it, how far away is it from 0? The negative just tells us that it's going to be to the left of 0. Nothing with it's going to just tell us to the right. All right, so what is the difference between a number's opposite and a number's absolute value? For some things like negative, let's say -10, its opposite would be 10, right? its absolute value actually is also going to be 10, right? Because that would be the distance from 0. Does the opposite always show the same as the absolute value? No. Think about 3. Its absolute value is 3, right? But what's 3's opposite? Yeah, 3's opposite is -3. So opposite doesn't necessarily mean that it's also the same thing for the absolute value. Absolute value is strictly the distance from that 0. Does finding a number's absolute value always mean changing the sign? Not necessarily. When you talk about positive numbers, it isn't. But when you're talking about negative numbers, it is. If n is any number that can be positive or negative, what is the sign of its absolute value? Yeah, it doesn't have a sign. It doesn't have a positive or a negative sign. It's just that number. So it doesn't matter what number you plug in there, any number, if you're talking about its absolute value, it's going to have neither a positive or a negative. It's just going to be the number. All right, let's talk a little bit about elevation and temperature. So part of the city of New Orleans is 6 feet below sea level. We can use -6 feet to describe the elevation, and the absolute value of -6 feet, we can write it like that, to describe its vertical distance from sea level. In the context of elevation, what would each of the following numbers mean? So this means 25 feet, and this would be 25 feet above sea level, right? This is absolute value of 25 feet, right? Yeah, and it's just going to be 25 feet above sea level, right? It's the distance of it, 25 feet from sea level. Here we're talking about -8 feet. That means 8 feet below sea level. And here, when we're talking about -8 feet, we would say that this is 8 feet to the left of 0, or 8 feet down from 0, I guess, in this sense, since we're talking vertically. We're not talking about positive or negative. We're just talking about the distance from. All right, let's look at a couple more here before we run out of time. We write -5 degrees Celsius to describe a temperature that is 5 degrees Celsius below freezing point, and 5 degrees Celsius for a temperature that's 5 degrees above freezing. So what are we going to talk about with each of these? Yep, so that 1 degree Celsius is 1 degree above 0. -4 degrees Celsius? Yeah, that's 4 degrees below the freezing point in Celsius. What about 12 degrees Celsius when we're talking about absolute? Yeah, its absolute value is that it is 12 degrees away from 0. And this is 7 degrees away from 0, even though it's negative. Let's look at this real quick. Which of these two temperatures is colder, -6 or 3 degrees? Yeah, -6 is colder, right? It's further to the left on a number line. On a thermometer, it would be lower than the 0. So it is colder. The 3 is actually closer to the freezing point because it is closer to 0. And that's, if you look at the absolute value, that's going to tell you that absolute value of -6 is 6 degrees away from 0, whereas 3 degrees is absolute value is just 3 away. All right, let's think about this, try and wrap up here real quick. If we ordered the numbers 1, 3, and 6 from least to greatest, it would just be 1, 3, and 6, right? What if we order their absolute values? Yeah, it's still going to be 1, 3, and 6. What about if we put -1, -3, and -6 from least to greatest? Yeah, it's going to be -6, -3, and -1, right? And what about their absolute values? yeah, if we go by absolute values, their distances from 0, it's going to be 1, 3, and 6, right? Because when we're talking about absolute value, that's just the distance from the 0. So, negative does make a difference. Positive makes a difference, but when we're talking about absolutes, it's going to be the same. The absolutes are going to make everything just talking about the distance from 0. So, we are just a shade over. Hey, thanks for hanging in.